Hi there! In this video, I will demonstrate how to use BPMN flow to synchronize SharePoint services. On the left side is a flow that I prepared for this demonstration. It contains 3 different stages. The first 3 boxes will help us understand how the source folder structure looks like. The next 3 are our target. Finally, we find delta and create folder structure inside the target based on the found delta. This is a high-level description of the flow. In the middle of the screen, we have the SharePoint source with different folders that have different names. It's like CRM 386208 in cloud. Let's call it SharePoint 1 for convenience. On the right side, we have something like CRM 365. It's a cloud SharePoint. Let's call it SharePoint 2 moving forward. And our task is to synchronize the folder structure following the source-to-target approach. Let's start with the flow. Here we have the starting point. The first 3 steps describe how we can set up the source target and get folder structure. Next, we will do the same for target, but using gateways that will analyze the behavior. For instance, if we have or don't have result, or if we have issues with connectivity, this step will be processed in different ways. Let's say we have issues with getting the source, so the flow finishes with an error that is returned to the user as a string. But if there are no issues, the flow proceeds to set target, get target folder structure. Then it defines data to find delta, saves it to global parameters, and finally finds delta. In case we don't have a delta, the flow returns empty as a string. If delta has been found, the flow creates folders in parallel. In this video, I will use 2 approaches that perform different logic. The first one will be call activity, which in fact is calling an external BPMN process built by someone else. I don't have to care how it's working under the hood, but I need it for my purposes. It's like a black box. And here, I'm using this black box twice because I divide the logic of getting the folder structure from SharePoint with different BPMN and reuse it. When I get the folder or target structure from the source, I'm using this BPMN externally. But what if we want to create folders in parallel? To do that, we need to break down the main process shown earlier into sub-processes. How can we do that? By clicking this blue arrow, we can go deeper into the specific sub-process and see what it looks like. With Create Folders in Parallel sub-process, we check the connection first. Here I'm using REST API function to create a URL post operation with some global parameters, and here I also have the body with some included parameters. Next, in parse success, I will be looking at HTTP response depending on its feasibility. SharePoint provides me with the property called isSuccess, and if it is successful, I will get true. Otherwise, I will get false. Here, I'm using the gateway with expression that checks the response that we got from the previous step. And the previous step returns JSON data type with a single value. If it's not equal to true, the process will hop to this element and return error as a folder name. But if the value is equal to true, the flow will proceed with create folder. Create folder is like execute operation for SharePoint, and inside of it we have some parameters. For example, here I've put SQL. It's like a token to SharePoint that we received from previous steps. I will explain more about this later in this video. And we also have input parameters as a folder name. When I connect an object reference with the input, which basically is the starting point of the event, it will define that data as input. I can access this data in my code at any time with reserved input keywords and also put variables with these keywords inside the body. It's also important to keep in mind that those should be strings. Next, after creating folders, I will parse the response and check whether it was successful. If it was, I will create a report and folder with the corresponding name. When I complete this BPMN process, I will have 2 different outcomes. In an unsuccessful case, I will have a folder called error. Otherwise, I will have a folder with the proper name. When we go to the call activity, we can see that I revoked an external process, but I can't take a deeper look of this process since it is a compiled DLL, so I simply execute it within my BPMN flow. But for demonstration purposes here, I have a simple BPMN flow, which also expects some input. Its type is credential SharePoint with properties such as username, password, and account name. And the last 2 properties will include the result of the execution of this flow. Let's take a look at how it works. The create a connection to SharePoint is very similar to post method when creating connections with SharePoint. We also have an expression, which will raise an error if something goes wrong. If the execution is successful, it will put the SQL value into global parameters with the corresponding name. Next, it will get a folder structure with parameters, for instance, the SQL from global parameters with instructions to execution. As a result, we will have a folder. After we get a successful response, the flow will parse the response using the JSON path function, which will allow us to get arrays from the included property of the lengthy JSON response. Finally, we will save this data within the initial input. To demonstrate this, I prepared custom code actions. Here we can see that the new object will have credential SP type with these three properties, which are values of the input. This is our initial data to run the workflow. The second SQL property comes from the global parameters that will be saved during this step. Previous is a special reserved keyword, meaning that I will take the result from the previous step. And here we see JSON folders because JSON path returns JSON type. Next, I will take these three properties from credential SP with SQL string and folder structure from this Lambda function. Since SharePoint returns many arrays with various prefixes that have to be removed in order to create folder names, including cases that return an error. Here, I'm using the substring function with 30 symbols to remove those prefixes. Now let's see how it works. First, we need to compile the process and execute it. There's also a debugging option, but we don't need it for now. Here, I've specified my JSON as input. Initially, it's an incomplete object with just three properties: username, password, and account name, which will be the external input data for our call activity. And after I execute the process, the object will get two other properties. Let's click Run now. As we can see, here we have SQL and folder structure from SharePoint 1. This process is similar to the atomic BPMN process, which connects to SharePoint, gets the SQL token and folder structure, and returns an object outside of this BPMN flow. Now, let's get back to the main BPMN workflow. We set source to revoke the execution, call the process, and as a result, get a fully prepared structure with SQL within it. This is the first step. The next step will be to do the same for the target, find the delta, and create folders. Let's take a look at the whole process. Here I don't have any input, and I don't need it, because the process is based on configuration which I prepared beforehand. I prepared various types, for instance, the SharePoint source with JSON schema with different properties. I defined source and target variables as parameters with some specific data. Here's our SharePoint 1, and here's SharePoint 2. When I run this workflow, it will use these parameters. I also prepared the HTTP config that has host, port, encoding, and content type. It's like a general configuration for all connections within my workflow. And I also declared the delta array as a string array. Now let's execute it. Click Run. As you can see, it's executing. So let's wait for a second. Done. Now we can see the delta. It has been successfully created within SharePoint. Let's check it. Here is SharePoint 1, and this is our SharePoint 2. If I refresh it, we can see newly created folders. Let me delete several folders real quick. Now I don't have them in my SharePoint 2 anymore, but I still have them in SharePoint 1. Now let's check it using the BPMN flow and execute it one more time. Click Run. And here we see those three folders that I've deleted. If I return back to SharePoint 2 and refresh it, we can see these folders again. That's it for this video. Thank you.